Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Measuring the Impact of CPD in Your School. My name is Costa, Constantinou, and I am going to be presenting today's webinar. I'm really excited to be sharing this presentation with you. We have a number of colleagues from around the world who are joining us. So I hope you enjoy the webinar and actually have something to take away and discuss with your senior teams. It's only 50 minutes, so there is only so much that we can cover, but I am hoping that it will give you an insight into some of the ways in which you can capture the impact of your professional development and the learning that is taking place. I have been an educator now for 17 years, and I came out of my school about 3 years ago, and one of the things that I feel really passionate about is being able to actually show impact. I know we use that word a lot in education at the moment, but I think when it comes to professional development, I think it's really important to actually show that you can evidence the change that's taking place. And I know some of what I'm going to say this afternoon, you probably do, but there are maybe some things that you can start to think about and put in place. So the main objectives for today are the following. Learn about the research evidence available on measuring the impact of teacher CPD. Plan some vital do's and don'ts when evaluating the impact of CPD within your school, and understand how evaluating the impact of CPD has the potential to improve teacher practice, accountability and the quality of learning, as well as determine value for money and allocation of time. And something I will say right at the beginning is that when it comes to CPD, I think it's really important to think about not just evaluating the CPD activity itself, it's also thinking about how that professional development will have an impact on teacher practice and also student outcomes, which is something I'm going to be mentioning quite a lot today, because I think that's really, really important. And it's a question that I often ask school leaders themselves now, you know, how do we know that we are getting our professional development right? And I think that's where we need to really think about not just the CPD objectives themselves, but also how we are going to measure and assess whether we've met those CPD objectives. So to begin with, I'm going to just cover a few terms that we use when it comes to CPD. So in your school, you might call it continuing professional development, CPDL, which is another term that we often use, training, or inset. Now for me and throughout this presentation, I'm going to be referring to CPDL, and it's something that, again, I feel that continuing professional development and learning is really, really important that we use that word learning, because it is about teachers being able to see themselves as learners. And I think this statement here is something that I believe in. I think that teachers need to see themselves as reflective practitioners. They need to see themselves as being able to grow and learn and be knowledgeable. And I think this statement for me really sums up the idea that we're moving away from the term just development, because I feel development is not really enough. It's the culture that we use around professional development as well, that we need to see ourselves as learners. Leading effective CPD. I know many of you who have registered for this afternoon's webinar are actually leading professional development within your schools. So I was just wondering, how many of these research articles have you actually come across, read, shared, evaluated? Because I think when we're leading effective professional development and learning, I think it's important to back up our model around the research that is available. And a lot of what I'm saying today is really coming from the work of the Teacher Development Trust, the Education Endowment Foundation, the work of Vivian Porritt, who was at the Institute of Education, around measuring the impact of professional development. And all these articles here all talk about the importance of impact and the impact that our actual professional development and learning has on supporting teachers grow as practitioners, the change in their practice, and also the what we want to see our students doing differently as a result of the professional development we offer within our schools. And I think impact there is really, really something that's important when we're putting together any professional development and learning program, that we're able to evidence and share the findings that we have within our schools and across our school. So I think I'm now going to give you some time to reflect on the following 5 questions. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds, I think is enough, to think about the following. Firstly, how do we know we are getting CPDL right in our schools? How often are the CPDL activities you participate evaluated? Do evaluation arrangements differ for different types of CPDL? Does feedback from evaluation influence future CPDL activities within your school? And lastly, does feedback from CPDL evaluation inform overall school improvement and planning? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds just to think about those 5 questions. I hope you've got your pen and paper next to you as well, and you're able to make some notes. So 30 seconds just to think about the following questions. Okay, so I think that was about 30 seconds. Always seems a lot longer than it does. So how do we know we're getting CPDL right in our schools? Well, you might actually give out a feedback form at the end of the session. You might carry out a lesson observation or a learning and development walkthrough. That's generally how we sometimes know that we are getting CPDL right in our schools. How do you often CPD activities you participate evaluate? So how often are they? Is it something that you do straight after? Normally that seems to be the most popular form of evaluation, that we seem to give a feedback form straight after a CPD activity, and that's really useful. But actually I think today is more about me exploring things that you can do in a bit more detail. So it might be that you actually carry out some evaluation 3, 4, or even 6 months after you've actually carried out a particular CPD program. Do evaluation arrangements differ for different types of CPDL? Well, I think, definitely yes. Okay, we're not asking, and I would definitely not say that you have to evaluate every single CPDL activity in the same way. For example, if you've provided EpiPen training for your staff, then that might actually not need you to evaluate and measure the impact of that training in exactly the same way as if you were to measure the impact of a particular CPDL activity around teaching and learning or leadership training that you've delivered. So I think there are different evaluation arrangements that you can make depending on the actual CPDL activity that you are running across your school, and you probably do that already. Does feedback from evaluation influence future CPDL activities? I think for me, that's a really, really important question, because I think if we're going to evaluate, continuing professional development and learning, I think it's really important that that influences, any future CPDL activity that we're going to run across our school. Research is actually suggesting that that is one of the least favoured method of evaluating, that actually there isn't really much evaluation that takes place that informs future CPDL activities. And I think that's something that we really need to consider, that do the results that we have influence any changes that we are going to make in the future. And does feedback from CPD evaluation inform overall school improvement and planning? Well, that's a question that I think is really important for you to think about, that when you are considering school improvement and ideas around, what type of training you need to provide your staff to make sure that you're meeting your school improvement objectives and planning, that your feedback that you've received around your professional development and learning has actually informed that process of planning. Now, these are lots of different methods that you can use, and some of you already use these methods and tools to actually obtain feedback around your professional development. Staff feedback forms, classroom observations, learning and development walkthroughs, staff interviews, improvement in student achievement, staff questionnaires, and parental feedback. Now, one of the most popular tools that is used to obtain feedback around professional development is staff feedback forms, and it's also one of the easiest ways to obtain feedback. But I want you to think about whether that's actually enough. Are there anything else that you could particularly do that will give you more of an insight into whether your professional development and learning program has been a success? And I am talking more about programs rather than just the one-off inset days, because I think that's important, that when we're looking at measuring the impact of our professional development program, that we're actually looking at a range of different professional development opportunities that we've provided our teachers with. So you will probably use some of these techniques, but think about how we can also just move away from just the staff feedback forms. Here are some facts here, and when I first came across this, I actually found this really, really interesting, because when we're talking about developing a strong CPD model, I think that strong CPD model needs to take into account some of the findings that are out there. So I'm just going to give you some facts here. Most evaluations seem to draw on the teacher, which can be superficial and lead to biased results. And that was given to us by Harris et al. In 2006. And I think when you're thinking about measuring the impact of CPDO in your school, think about how you can not just rely on teacher feedback, because that can often be very subjective. We want to also draw on other tools that can give us more of an overview on how we can measure the training objectives, whether we've met those objectives and whether there is any more support or any changes that we need to make. But just relying on the teacher giving you information is rather subjective. The logical chain found that few schools evaluated the impact of CPD on teaching and learning. Again, that's quite a surprising finding, because when we're looking at the purpose of professional development, the purpose of professional development is to support teachers grow as practitioners, to get better, to influence change in certain areas, and to support teaching and learning. So when we are thinking about measuring the impact of CPD, I think it's really important to think about how that is going to be measured against raising standards within teaching and learning. Only 24% of schools evaluate changes in pupil attitudes. Now, again, it's really important that when we're thinking about professional development, we're not just evaluating the professional development activity itself. We're thinking about, how is this going to help our students learn differently? The professional development that I'm making available to my staff, how is that going to have an impact on the students' learning? So I think that's something that we need to consider. Organisational change, value for money, and changes in teacher behaviour were less likely to be evaluated. I think, again, thinking about the organisational change, how is it affecting the school as a whole? Are we looking at what we're doing as a school to support the growth, the change in teacher practice? Is the professional development actually value for money? Have we got any evidence to show that it has been a success and it's been worth us spending this amount of money to invest in whatever we're choosing to focus on? And 10% of evaluation taking place rarely influences the planning of any future CPD. Again, 10%, that's extremely low. So thinking about, how can we actually have, a real model around measuring the impact of CPD that is actually going to allow us to, inform changes in future CPD activities that we do? Do we share the findings, for example, with our staff that we have, the feedback forms that we give out, the evidence that we have, the lesson observations? Do we actually look into that and analyse that closely to inform any future CPD activity? So I've just based some facts there. I've taken those from lots of different research studies, and I'm just going to go back to the slide that I showed you before. You will be getting this presentation, but leading effective CPDL, I think I would really encourage you to think about reading some of these articles, this research, because it really does give us an insight into how we can lead effective professional development in our schools, and also consider how we're going to have impact in what we do. So there are two purposes of CPD evaluation. The first one is summative. And the summative purpose really is to show us the overall positive outcomes to the school. Has the CPD activity been a success? And what are the benefits to what we've done? And I think that's, again, really, really important, because we want to highlight what has worked well. The second purpose is formative, and that's really to inform any changes that we need to make to the CPD program. And again, it shouldn't be something that's just done at the end. I think measuring the impact of CPD needs to be done throughout a CPD activity. So we can actually make changes to a particular program that we've put in place. Things might have not actually worked as well as what we thought they would have. So it's important to actually obtain that information so that we can then put things right. So the two purposes there really inform us as to why we need to measure the impact of CPD. Now, measuring the impact of CPD is sometimes often neglected. It might be because it's seen as being difficult, but it's not always done as well as it should. So I'm now going to give you 10 seconds, not very long, just to think about some of the reasons for why evaluation doesn't always get done. Okay, so you might have thought about some of the following. Maybe there's a lack of time. In school, I've been a teacher, and many of you are still in school listening to this presentation. We are running around, we are very busy, so there's not always the time to actually think about measuring the impact of our CPD. So lack of time, maybe the lack of money and resources, not being able to actually invest in this as much as we'd like to. Maybe it's difficult to measure. How do I actually go about measuring the impact of the CPDL program that I've put in place? Do I actually know how to do it? Maybe I'm not confident enough to measure the impact. I find it difficult, therefore it's not always done. Lack of knowledge and expertise, well, I've just spoken about that. And maybe the data can be unreliable. How do I actually know that what I have obtained is actually valid? And do I have reliable data? So those are some of the reasons for why evaluation might not always get done within schools. I think why evaluation needs to be done much better is really, really important for us to think about. So I've got a couple of images here as to show why evaluation needs to be done better. So one is here we've got evidence. We need to have the evidence as to what's worked, maybe what hasn't quite worked, and what we can maybe do to actually improve. So when we are thinking about our CPD objectives, do we have the evidence to say this has definitely worked? We know the benefits are there. And do we actually have the evidence to say this is what we need to do to get even better. I think we also need to be able to show that we've met our CPD objectives. And I think this is something that we need to outline from the beginning. Again, when I go into schools now with Veema, I always ask schools about what are their CPD objectives? What do they want to get out of the professional development training? And then I start to talk about, okay, so how are we going to measure whether this has been achieved, and have an action plan in place to actually show how you've met your objectives. I think it needs to be done much better, because we're actually asking our teachers to invest their own time, to grow as practitioners, as I've said, to change certain things. Maybe it's about changing certain things that they do, or to learn new things. And I think if it's going to be valuable, and if we're really going to invest in truly seeing professional development as being really successful and important, then I think we need to invest the time into getting some data around what's working well. I think obviously to highlight the strengths, you can see from this image here of the boy, where actually we can outline our achievements, how far we've come is really important, but also evaluation needs to be done much better, because we need to think about what areas we need to focus on as well, what improvements can be made. So I think they're really the main areas of why evaluation needs to be done much better. I think it's also really vital that we're clear about whom we are evaluating. And here I've got some images of the different ways in which we can evaluate whether a professional development program has been successful. Clearly, we want to look at the outcomes for the students. The reason why we have professional development is to obviously improve outcomes for our students. And I think there needs to be some thought given to how we're going to seek feedback from student outcomes as well. Teachers themselves, we need to be clear about that we are also looking at evaluating the impact this is having on teachers. However, bearing in mind what I said before, that we're not just relying on teachers to give us that information, we're seeing actually how else can we track changes and monitor this as well. And also improvements for the school, seeing actually what the benefits would, the outcomes and benefits for the school. And the community, is the professional development we are offering also going to have an impact on the community? And in some cases, it actually will. I think knowing what to evaluate, I think, again, that is crucial, because when we're looking at CPD evaluation, we need to think about the following areas. It's about knowledge, understanding and skills, values and beliefs, and also changes in actions and behaviour. Are there things that we want to see done differently within the school? So knowing what to evaluate, I think, is imperative. The skills, the understanding of certain ideas. It could be that your focus is on mastery learning, or good questioning, or literacy, but also being able to really think about, what is it that I will be evaluating? I think it's really important that when we are looking at measuring the impact of CPDL, we draw on lots of different methods and tools to obtain data, both quantitative and qualitative data. I know questionnaires and surveys are often used, but how can we just move away from that? I think questionnaires and surveys are really good, and they shouldn't, we shouldn't stop there. But actually, how often do we conduct follow-up interviews with teachers to ask them about the learning that they've actually taken part in, to address how much knowledge and skills have they obtained from the professional development program? Focus group meetings, focus observations. I mean, do we have a system in place that enables us to go in and see whether some of this new learning and understanding is actually being put in place. Is it being implemented? I think feedback sheets, again, really, really important, and reflection logs. Do we have professional development logs which allows teachers to reflect on the professional development activities that they've taken place? So I think it's really, really important that when we're thinking about the tools that we're going to use, that we're actually using lots of different methods to obtain some information. Now I'm going to draw on Guskey's 5 levels of professional development evaluation, because I think what Thomas Guskey, and I don't know if you've heard of Thomas Guskey, but I really would recommend his book there. I've got a little a picture there, Evaluating Professional Development, and a lot of the work that I've done within this area, I've used Guskey as a framework to think about measuring the impact of professional development. And I think he gives us a real good insight into how we can move away from just looking at a superficial evaluation around CPD and actually going into this a bit deeper. And he talks about obtaining information on 5 different levels: participant reaction, participant learning, organisational support and change, so measuring how the organisation has supported the change, change in actual behaviour, so changes in teachers' behaviour, have we actually seen progress being made, and student outcomes, how is this actually benefiting our students? And with Guskey's model, it's really important to actually maybe work backwards. So when you're thinking about your professional development program, you think about actually number 5 and work your way upwards to seeing how that professional development will have an impact on students, and also how you're going to obtain that data. So level 1 is the initial reaction. Now, I think this is probably the easiest form of evaluation that we do. I would assume that many of us and many school leaders will actually do this. It's about seeking a response from the participants straight after. You know, it's normally done on the same day, in some cases a couple of days later. And Guskey says that, you know, really we are focusing on 3 different areas here. And I'm just going to take my pen here so that I can show you. So we form questions around the content. So, you know, was the information that was covered, was it relevant to a participant's particular need? Is it something that they feel that they're able to use? Was their time well spent? You know, it's important to ask those questions regarding the content. You know, is it something that they feel that they've spent their time has been valuable? The second type of questions that you might want to cover under initial reaction is process. And I think process questions is actually, how were things actually done? You know, was the objectives made clear at the beginning? Was the presenter knowledgeable? And I think, again, these are really useful questions that when we're seeking any feedback from our teachers or staff that are taking part in professional development, I think it's really important to think about those kind of questions, because it can inform us as to what we need to perhaps do next time to improve the program itself. And the last question is around context. And I think any survey or questionnaire should have information about context. For example, the environment. Was there enough space to move around, to do the activities that were covered during the professional development day? Were the chairs comfortable? Things around refreshments. All of these questions are really, really important. And I think, initial reaction is probably one of the easiest forms of evaluation that we can do. And I think it's something that we often see actually being done. So I've got a couple of key questions here. What I should say is that if you do want some more information, we can't cover everything today, but if you do want some more information or examples of questions that maybe should go into a feedback evaluation sheet, then obviously feel free to get in touch with me because I'm more than happy to share that information. Now, level 2 is about assessing participants' learning. And really here, what we're focusing on is, have they actually learned what was intended? How much have participants actually come away with, and what are they going to take away from this? And I think, assessing learning is really, really important. It's a bit like AFL in the classroom where you're checking to see how much learning has taken place. What have students really understood and taken away from this? What are they able to do? At level 2, really, we're looking at, did the learner obtain new knowledge and skills? Does it confirmed what was intended and what was achieved? And I think that is really, really important, because sometimes, we can, aim to cover things and people will take away different things, but actually what was achieved by all of those people that were taking part in the professional development, how confident are we that they're actually going to use and be able to try out some of the techniques? And I think assessing participants' learning is something that isn't always done. Are we just going to rely, for example, on what the teachers or our staff are telling us? How else are we going to try and assess their learning? So it might be through observations, learning and development walkthroughs that we assess participants' learning. I think I've covered that. What are they able to do with what they've learned? And I think at this stage, it's really, really important, because obtaining feedback on participants' learning will actually show whether the professional development has been a success in initiating any change. I think the implementation stage, are they going to implement some of the new ideas, the knowledge and the skills that we want them to? So being able to have a clear plan in place to get some information on this level is really, really important. It could also be through a reflection journal as well as classroom observations. So level 3, Guskey talks about actually how important it is at an organisational level to measure the impact of change. So how supportive has the organisation been in facilitating this change in behaviour, to facilitate changes in skills and abilities? And I think it's really, really important to think about, as a school, are you when you're thinking of your professional development, are you putting the right measures in place to support change? Were sufficient resources made available? It might be that you have a professional development library that teachers can tap into. It might be that you've actually put in place coaching sessions. Are you actually being able to measure the success of those? Have they been useful for teachers and your staff to actually support them in their professional development? Are the successes recognised and shared as well? Do you share those successes among the school? And I think that there is really, really important, that we're able to share some of the information that we're getting around organisational support. What was the impact on the organisation? So the professional development himself, what was the impact on the organisation? Level 4, and I think changes in behaviour. Whenever we're thinking about professional development, it's important to think about how is that going to lead to sustained changes in teacher behaviour. And level 4 is something that, unlike the other levels, you can do maybe a week or even a couple of months after. I think level 4 is going to be something that you're going to do you're going to delay it slightly, because changes in behaviour takes time, and it's not something that can be done straight away. So I think focus on changes in behaviour as a result of the CPDL. Did participants apply the new knowledge and skills effectively? And were they sustainable? And I think going back to level 2, when we're assessing teachers' learning, that's why it's so important that at that stage we're obtaining some information. How much have they actually learned? Because what they've learned is going to have an impact on any change in their particular behaviour. So changes in behaviour are really, really important, but it's not something that can be done straight away. Again, it might be through coaching sessions, it might be through lesson observations, through video, audio and video footage, where you're actually capturing changes in how teachers are putting things in place in the classroom in order to facilitate change. And I think that is something to really think about. Are we obtaining enough information to be able to measure the impact of our professional development in terms of what's happening across the school in our classrooms? Did the learning translate into better practice? And I think, again, that is something for us to always think about when we are focusing on professional development. It's the idea that it is going to translate into better practice. And are the practices really different to what participants did before? Are you able to have some information on capturing that change? And I think, if teachers within your school do feel comfortable with being filmed, I think, filming lessons is a wonderful opportunity to actually see how these little changes in the things that we do actually take place. So level 5, Guskey talks about evaluating, measuring the impact on also student learning, which I think is really, really important. And we know from research, I've outlined it earlier before, that it's often a neglected area. We don't always think about how this is having an impact on student learning. So is it around actually, student performance and achievement? It could be about attitudes, changes in physical and emotional well-being. Are students more confident as a result of the professional development program that we've put in place? If you're looking at something around attendance, has attendance improved? Actually obtaining some feedback on students and how this can be done is really, really important. So I would ask you to think about that when you are measuring the impact of professional development, you also think about involving students in this process as well, and seeing what evidence you will have to measure the impact. So evaluating the impact of CPD in your school, just to highlight some do's and don'ts, because I did say that at the beginning that we will look at some do's and don'ts. So here are some do's. Plan how you will evaluate a CPD impact right away from the start. Know what you want children to learn differently because of the CPD. Use a range of quantitative and qualitative data for evaluation, such as questionnaires, interviews, focus group meetings, observations, feedback sheets, and reflection logs. These are all different ways in which you can use to obtain some data. Carefully consider the nature of the questions you use to assess the impact of CPD, so answers provide a real insight. I think it's really important to think about the questions that you are going to actually use, whether it's through interviews, whether it's the questions that you have in your feedback forms, the coaching sessions that you're going to put in place. I think it's really important to consider the nature of the questions. Focus on measuring the difference the CPD makes to the teacher practice and students' outcomes rather than just the activity itself. Again, that kind of falls into Guskey's level 1 reaction, the initial reaction to the CPD. I think it's really important to just move away from just the activity itself. Are we measuring the impact of our CPD in terms of how this is going to have an effect on our teachers and the student outcomes? And involve all participants in the evaluation process from the beginning. I think CPD evaluation is not just something that happens at the end, it's something that should be ongoing. It needs to be thought of very clearly at the beginning, rather than just adding it as a tag on at the end. So, and I think that's something that is definitely a don't. Don't just see it as an add-on. It should be embedded throughout the process, and you should be getting information at different stages. Don't see evaluations as just the job of the senior leadership team. It's a job for everyone. And I think, again, that's really, really important that we see this as the job of everyone. It's not just for the leadership team as a tick box exercise. It's something that is really going to benefit us, because we're going to know whether this whether our CPD has been a success, and maybe what we need to do differently in the future to enable it to be a success. Don't just evaluate participant perceptions. Now, I've said this, and I think that's really, really important. And all the research kind of shows that it's not just about the participant's perception. It's also about, what else are we seeing? Is for example, the person that's going in to observe the teacher, are they seeing the same differences? Are they on the same page as the actual teacher? So I think it's really important to not just take into account the participant's perception. Don't make CPD evaluations burdensome. It can be difficult, and like I said, you don't have to evaluate everything, but choose what you are going to measure, what type of CPD evaluation you're going to cover, and with a bit of thought, thinking about the right tools. It doesn't have to be something that's difficult. So I've just tried to cover in that brief space of time just some things that you can think about. Some of these areas you might be covering already, but it's just really an opportunity for you to think about how you can measure the impact a bit more in your school in terms of the CPD that you offer, and how that is going to inform future practices, and how actually are we going to get the best out of our teachers. We do have a CPD evaluation toolkit coming out soon. On this toolkit, you will find resources that will help you measure and assess the impact of CPD. And it will have from a range of teacher questionnaires to interview questions that you can use, as well as student questions that you can give out to see what changes they've realized, what changes they've actually seen from as a result of the professional development. Now, if you're planning CPD for next year, we have a number of different programs available currently on our website. We're also looking for host schools to host some of our CPD programs. We are also saying that you can always open this up to other schools within your area. So we're thinking of lots of creative ways, collaborative opportunities for some great CPD. But if you are planning CPD for 2018-19, then do get in touch and see how we can support you with this. And just to draw your attention to our website, because on our website we have lots of free resources. We regularly send out information to schools, little bits of practical tips that you can use in the classroom, and we have a research corner that has lots of different research papers, whether it's around CPD, whether it's around leadership, safeguarding, teaching and learning. We update the research corner regularly, and you can just take a look and see how you feel and where you can use that within your school. One of our mission is to connect educators and classrooms all around the world. And that's one of the reasons why we do the webinars, because it makes it easy for people to come online and just listen to some information that's out there around education, and maybe take a few ideas to implement them in the classroom. So I hope you found today's session useful. It was just an idea or a start to get you thinking about how you can measure the impact of your CPD using Guskey's 5-level approach, using some of the research that is out there. If you would like to ask me any questions about what I've covered today, or what I have put across in my paper, which I put together last year, then feel free to get in touch and we can discuss this in more detail. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed today's webinar and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.